Hello, this is Jonathan. Your ideas on what different types of books, your descriptions of different books here. Okay, you have that book about this guy who's like a candy maker and or a uh sweets and confection salesman or person who does that job, and a confectioner, yes, and basically you don't know what else to say, but basically he has this factory, yes, and there's a competitor, right? Yeah. And basically the idea is he competes with this person, and what? No. And basically he has the idea. No, he has basically to compete or to uh, uh, he has to one up the competitor or the uh, opposition, and uh, the uh, yeah. And then basically he gets along with the opposition, but uh, this is after he has this kind of fan base that he develops, almost, and it kinda is basically he just a hangout session, and he becomes a celebrity, and he has a bunch of wonderful ideas, and they overcome the fact that they have to uh, dominate the competition of the confectionaries. The confections. And then to make themselves better, they uh, partner up. Okay, next idea. The future. The future is now. You can simply wind a clock, and that will make it so that you have money in the bank. That is to say, there is no currency, there is no anything physical or digital. It's just the fact that you spent time producing energy, and you now have that. And you wrote about this somewhere, though you didn't write much down. You have very little information to go off of other than a page and a chat with an AI bot about the same concept. other concept. I don't even really remember much about this one because I barely even thought about it in detail in a while. But there's fish people. There's the fish people there. They have extremely different lives than you would expect. They are nothing like doing anything that a fish person might be doing. They're just like any other normal human being person, but they aren't people. They look like fish, and they are genetically fish, but they're they live not even in a human society. Their society is a human society. They are humans, and humans don't live amongst them. They live, like, I guess, on the same planet, but, well, they live. They don't interact much at all. Maybe they only have heard very little information directly from the fish people. I don't know. It takes place in the future too, I think. Anyways, something about an elf. A very traditional style of elf from like before Tolkien or before the 1800s, before even the 1600s, all the way back, going back to the like early 1500s and 1400s on the descriptions of elves and stuff like that. And basically, it's a perspective of some sort of very specific type of unique, particular adventure or journey of an elf or personal life, like particular specific things that are very, very, very concerning of the elf. Maybe this elven creature is very much like, maybe the elven creature is very, of course, like, I don't know, they're a pirate captain, maybe, or they own a factory. Maybe they're, I don't know, God. Maybe they have godlike powers. I don't know. It doesn't have to be any of those things. I don't know. I want something very unique if it were to be described for what a person is doing, or or it's going to be very, very ordinary, but still very fantastical and specific to only something an elf could do. Um, basically, uh, 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 and basically the perspective is you don't know what they're describing until it gets into a specific detail where you literally have to think about it as if you are the height of an elf. And it makes you physically, emotionally, conceptually, and just socially when you think about the feeling that, or the type of imagery it's describing is basically just, well, well basically like, you know, the whole thing is just impossible to understand until you realize what is being described or being described by the elf. Basically, you know what your life will be like if you were to become an elf. And you just feel a sense of magic and whimsy and wonder and joy from not having to experience the ordinary mundane life of a human person. Not even you're not living even like compared to a more typical book about an actual person or a more realistic fictional story or even a fictional story about an actual human person, you'll be able to have something completely different by it being an elf. I don't know. I still have to work a lot on that one. Make a book that's basically the same kind of format and style and textual kind of story where basically you just retell Alice in Wonderland through replacing or substituting the different characters with your own original characters and make the plot line slightly different. But make it good and make it enjoyable and make it actually somehow worthwhile, though you have a lot of learning to do to make those few sentences that you just said of make it good and make it actually worthwhile. You have to do more thinking and research and planning and working on developing that specific concept. Okay, next one. I don't know. You just remembered Wild West Adventure. Another thing, like maybe a Wild West Adventure combined with The Wizard of Oz, or maybe do that, but also do The Wizard of Oz and Wild West Adventure. I don't remember anything else. What else? You wanted to describe your opinions, views, beliefs, and so on and so forth. Just as many types of categories of way of thinking about the sunset. And also do scientific research on sunsets and describe your own point of view on what that research has brought you to conclude about sunsets. Write a nonfiction book on your own ideas on puzzles or words or language or English in specific. Roll it down to maybe English or puzzles. Just puzzles. I don't know. Just have it be a kind of a stream of thought, or also maybe a documentation on English or puzzles, but also parts of the book would be a stream of conscious or a stream of thought for that. You don't have any much else to do here. What else? What else you have? Chimley. The chimney sweep is very happy. He has a job worth doing. He enjoys his job. The chimney sweep in the 1800s that never existed, but is likely somebody could find a comparison to somebody that might be very similar. Basically, a chimney sweep who somehow figured out a way to enjoy being a chimney sweep and also take advantage of all the opportunity of keeping himself safe. The man who just won't die. That is to say, a man who will live forever. A man who has always existed since uh, the first development of the Earth before it had water or any land or any ocean or anything like that. It was just a black blank slate, and he was the first man before that, which is not reality, but let's just say that man existed and he still exists as the story goes on. Yeah, basically a history of the Earth, but from the perspective of just one specific fictional, imaginary type of person. What else? A story that is about a story that starts with somebody's life in ancient Rome that would lead to somebody also having the same journey coinciding that can be basically parallel to their history. They basically have a parallel history that they live basically like parallel lives, but one is from ancient Rome and the other is from either the future or now. Another thing, one of your stories or one of your books was a comic book about the household of a group of animals that have wonderful, extraordinary adventures and lives and can use magic to hunt inanimate food sources that aren't they aren't inanimate in their view of those food sources, because the food sources can make noise that they interpret as actual speaking, because they have the ability to understand what those noises coming from those things mean something, and they hunt them down as if they are alive because they can escape from them, so they basically use their imagination, but in any other way it's just magic animals, and they don't stand upright, but they can stand halfway upright, and they visit their friends who live in zoos, who are allowed to visit them, but the animals in the zoos can't go out and journey with them, but they can go into the zoo and play. I don't know. It's really weird. I don't know. Uh, 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 they also um they talk out loud in English, which anybody could hear if they they are friends with a gnome. The gnome has to translate for anybody who's around, because for anybody else it just sounds like vague human mumbling that can be uh, somewhat understood as actual English sentences, but sounds like actual animals. Like, you know how animals, when they speak, quote unquote, like for instance, a parrot can be clearly saying a sentence, but a cat might imitate something that sounds like they're speaking actual English, but that's what they sound like sometimes. But also sometimes at the same time, it might sound like a person mumbling, restrained, like they have restrained speech naturally. And the sort of idea is basically they can't speak clearly, but eventually they do start sounding like they're trying to speak in a normal English sentence, but uh, it sounds more like animals just being funny. And the gnome translates to the few people that are actually going to appear. It will be a monthly uh monthly thing. Monthly uh monthly comic. Uh so, mm, mm, mm. What else? There's something. You also wanted to write about some sort of person going into a door, and they have the door is angled at over it, like a nearly impossible slant that it's almost as if uh here it's almost like these boxes here that in the way that they're tilted. Basically, it's a slant that's more than less than 45 degrees. It's like weird slanted. It's a door like that, but it's also very small, and it's also round and rotund, and it also has impossible angles. But before you do that, you have to just figure out how to open a door that's connected to doors, to connected doors, to interlocking doors that, and also maybe sometimes there's just a bunch of doors in the area. It's just very complex. And once you get open to that door, you get to that door, where it's the small, rotund, kind of round door that's on an extreme slant with a very unusual shape, like a circle, but the actual archway of the door or the entering way is at an even more impossible, confusing shape. And then once you get into that, which is really easy to do, you just take your time and it will open up once you try as many solutions as possible. You can't go back until you're done in that world. The world starts off as a jungle, or at least, well, once you actually get into the world. I am not going to describe that now, but the door has to be found before this advance. Basically, you will find your way into a duplicate of your home, and that will lead to those doors, and then you will find yourself in a jungle. And basically, the jungle will be literally of the grassy landscape and the ginormous trees and like a rainforest almost, and like a safari type jungle. But eventually you get lost in there. You wander around, and it changes surreally and weirdly. It just becomes a completely different place, like a desert or a Arctic place, Antarctic like place, like a snowy desert or something. And then it like transitions from there and there and there, and eventually goes into some sort of village or town, and then, well, I don't know, something like that, were nonsensical, impossible, confusing, surreal, and dreamscape, like weird, like things that can't exist, that are bizarre, not too colorful. Normal colors, muted colors sometimes even, standard, basic, like ordinary colors, and without like almost like the completely visual, like almost reflections of glass and swirling and turning like that. No, just bizarre, but like achievable if you were to fall asleep or to uh have a headache and have blurry vision, or if you're hallucinating of the mental illness type of natural phenomena, uh or anyways, uh, or or like if you were to feel sickly. I don't know. Just don't make it too trippy, but like keep it illogical, surreal, dreamscape, vaguely dreamscape, just illogical, surreal, somewhat surreal. Illogical and nonsensical. Those are your two goals with that book. Now you have so many descriptions of specific events. You don't have a specific timeline or order in which these go, though the idea of this book is that it completely doesn't make any sense. You can read it from the very center of the book and go from the end and then start at the what would normally be the beginning, and you would still have a complete understanding of what the event is. There is a basic understanding. There is a plot, and it is something you can envision, but other than that, you're like going to be overwhelmed and consumed into the book, completely absorbed for a moment hence, and you will be very vivid with your imagination, it seems, and then you will be completely puzzled but amused with your book that you have purchased from me, making it available on a shelf at a store like Barnes and Nobles. Anyhow, there's a few more that you've thought of. Something along the lines of Dune, Star Wars, and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You have something in mind, but there's more specific titles that you've thought of. There's so many more. In fact, now at this point, you have actually, yeah, uh, mm, yes, the sniff. Anyways, the toe. Anyways, great link from The Legend of Zelda. Again, that is to say, make a world very similar to The Legend of Zelda, high fantasy, but describe it in a way that reminds the reader of The Legend of Zelda very, very specifically. But it's not a video game. It's not a movie. It's not a TV show. It's a book, and it's not specifically The Legend of Zelda, but it has the visuals of The Legend of Zelda, and that's it. It doesn't have the plot. It doesn't have the characters. It doesn't have the worldview. It doesn't have the anything other than what the vibe I get from uh, The Legend of Zelda. What the vibe is that I get from The Legend of Zelda with its colors and its architecture, or its physical, or the like texture of its manifestation, or the patterns of, or the textiles of the manifestation of the characters, or the colors of the way that things are described in the Legend of Zelda series. Anyways, also, there's mirror world. I don't know. There's so many ideas that you had involving this that you can't decide on one specific one. So basically, the idea is you say this. You describe what it's like for a reflection of yourself to view you outside of its world, and you describe a life in a reflection while the viewer of that reflection is away and when the viewer isn't away. Though no stuff where the reflection starts having independent thoughts and actions and decisions from what the actual reflection is of, like the person specifically. It will be a normal reflection, but it has like a secret life of reflection.
Dad's going to the mailbox. I'll be right back.
World, and just describe a world that's very vivid in how it describes what the inside of a mirror might look like if you could live in it. A dinosaur. A dinosaur is the reader. That is to say, you describe what a dinosaur is doing without using words that a dinosaur can't say. That is to say, you describe things by only adverbs or like onomatopoeia, and you don't say stuff where the dinosaur doesn't have a perspective. That is, no, the dinosaur does have a perspective, but the dinosaur doesn't narrate the story. You might have to do like a third person description or a second person description, which would basically mean that you heard about what the dinosaur did somehow. I don't know. But basically, just don't give the dinosaur a dialogue or monologue. You just describe what's happening around the dinosaur. What's its happenings? What else? You also described a book about alien world being visited, but everybody is already there. That is to say that humans exist again on a different planet. They have a big freckle on their nose. I don't know. Their ears are hairy. More hairy than normal humans. I don't know. Maybe their teeth are particularly sharp when they can morph them. I don't know. Something along those lines. I don't know. Humanity and even Earth creatures and the planet Earth basically exists in another galaxy. In fact, the solar system exists again. But that means there are two solar systems of, like Earth, inside the same dimensions of reality or galaxy. Within the same galaxy, there is another solar system and Earth in this book. And people are there too, but they have one major difference or flaw that makes them stand out even in a silhouette that is different about them that you can tell. Another thing is another very similar story where basically the whole thing is that this unpopulated non animal world, or that is to say, this planet has life, but there is no animals or people or anything else that exists like insects, and there is only plants, water, and like other things like funguses and bacteria on the planet that is vaguely similar to Earth, but is still very foreign. Is quite similar in some regards in specific areas and locations. In fact, even more specific locations might be basically identical to Earth, yet this planet is uninhibited and humans slowly take it over or colonize it, yet there is no conclusion on what the final society looks like. You make Dune, but instead of it being about Paul Atreides, it's about some other young adult who is already older than a teenager, but like at the beginning they're like 19. No. Mm, mm, Nay, nay. But basically, you have like they start off as a 18 or 18, like 19-year old, and um, they're like 20, almost 19 going on 20, but they're really bad. No, they're incompetent with literally being a regular citizen, and no. They're very competent on being a regular citizen, and they're very good at being an ordinary subject of the kingdom. But just before that is leading up to being king, they're uh uh still really bad at being anything else but a super intelligent and advanced citizen of the ordinary mundane type. The subject became the king, and they go to different planets to find a mentor to help them, and they go to space. They're not moving, their family is not moving to any new planet, but they decided to take a vacation while their king, their father, no, their mother, I think, has to take the place of this person with their approval. Basically, the mother, the queen, is the almost like the servant of their son almost, and they're also doing this they're also on vacation while mom is servant of them. And basically then they go to, instead of a desert planet, they find a arctic winter landscape that also has a super metropolis that is at the very center of the world, but also it slowly goes out from being a nothing landscape to being every 1,000 miles, or maybe more realistically, every few hundred miles, about 700 miles. Each 700 miles is, or each 630 miles approximately is uh, uh, a small village, and then a small community of villages, and then a small town, and then a city, and then a metropolis eventually. It builds up until they find a metropolis. They live in this icy winter metropolis that has a very specific ecosystem for keeping people and things and places and ideas and stuffs warm and ready and preserved all the time, because they haven't developed anything else to live in a non-primitive way if their basic technology is failed. Because basically the society has always been primitive in a way, but it just in the last 200 years before this equivalent of Paul is advanced. Basically, they just developed new technologies that would allow them to stop living in the equivalent of the 1790s when it comes to keeping Antarctic or Alaskan type place sustainable and livable. But the whole planet is like that, so they just started to develop enough things to live in a now 2020 nine maybe, or 2050 type way of living. Between the 2030s to the 2050s, their technology would be like, even though this takes place like 2,000 years after 2026, nearly. More like maybe like 1,758 years later, but whatever. It's a long time in the future for now, from today, as of recording, the date being at Friday, January 23rd, 2026, at 2:02 p.m. And there is basically 1,000 years from that date to the actual place where this takes place. And they learn a lot, Paul. And even when they return, they become the supreme emperor almost. Not really, though, but they become a great, world-renowned king who is spoken like a god, but everything else is, they're just not a god. They're just a really good king that who's perfect for that job and always has been, but still couldn't ever actually do literally anything with what they have done. Next, nonfiction now. Observations on plants and comparing them to mammals in whatever way I feel is wanted or necessary by me. Lots of different history books. One of them talking about the various different ways of thinking about U.S. history and why we can still appreciate America and American history, and even those who owned slaves, without thinking about the fact that they don't need to be judged just for having slaves. We don't have to judge them for the fact that everything about them isn't just the fact that they are about slavery. Though that's not true, I want to analyze the differences uh, uh, on what these ideas can what we can learn from these people outside of slavery, and voices of all sorts of different people, including the slaves themselves, will be included. In fact, it might come, well, actually, depending on who was born first and what perspective we're talking about, which order is more earlier in the timeline, we focus on a certain person and give them their voice and history as documented from something else, or reverse. No. Basically, the idea is this: explaining my opinions on very complicated, difficult issues, like giving clear outlines on my opinions to people on difficult subject matters throughout the history of America, but specifically the difficult opinions on slavery, and explaining how I also agree that these ideas of what people held in that time period were justified for saying was wrong. That is to say, the people in those times, I want to explain why they were right on what other people's belief of having slaves was wrong. Basically, I want to tell the audience how I feel about opinions from that time period that denounce and disapprove of slavery, and why I agree with them, but also agree with modern understandings and current relevant understandings of slavery and stuff like that, and difficult struggles like involving that, like difficult extreme problems, sufferings of those time periods. Illnesses, like ills and problems, like, and towards it. I want to basically talk about these ideas and how they are still wrong, even if you have a different perspective, and what you can learn and get from others' opinions from that time period. Move on. Okay, well, I have the idea ready somewhere. Hopefully, I'll remember it. Basically, the next idea is to talk about the everyday moments and time frames and experiences of either specific people that actually lived and what their day-to-day routines were like, basically documenting different people's journals and what we also discovered on from like what their garbage and their old leftover stuff that they have, uh like, if they have any silverware, I'll talk about what the silverware that they had. Mm. 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 Anyways, what was it? Basically, ordinary. Mm, just describing the basic routine and lives within their household, but also outside of their household. What other events and people and how the other certain people socially interacted from year one. There is no year one, but like uh, mm, 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 mm. Also, I wanted to include in this chronicle of different um, um, of different specific, maybe real people, or maybe mostly more or less describing a like example of a person hypothetical who could have existed, or a like conceptual person, more or less, like to maybe like not have to get so involved with the actual people that probably wouldn't want to be analyzed like they're like some sort of, well, what we have of them is mostly a document, so they don't want to be viewed as literally the document. They would want to be viewed as a person that existed, of course, but I don't feel like maybe finding somehow basic information that would get involved with Anyways, mm, 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 um, anyway, just describe the basic architecture and involvement of society outside of politics, war, and social trends and pop culture. Just describing. No, those are two completely different books. Um, and then they have the mm, 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 and just like describe the general community. I don't know, something like that. Just describe ordinary people that don't make as much, get as much focus on mm, and also describe the everyday lives of non-politicians and non-military people, I guess, and non-events of the war and a war and the thing, money, commerce, and trade. Don't describe those as much. Any of those things, leave as little of that as you possibly can. Get more involved in pop culture and culture events, social events, and stuff like that, but not so much with the obvious and blatant stuff. And, mm, 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 mm. No. Mm, 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 mm. Basically describe viewpoints outside of the main view. Pop culture can be there, but you just don't describe basics and describe things that are outside of the more ordinary, like the subcultures and stuff like that, and maybe even like pop culture that was more influenced by subculture or the other way around. I don't know. Just describe different things from the typical fashion. I don't know. Anyways, make a bunch of different books or make one book describing the more typical way of describing an era. You go from like 1900 to like 2010. Mm, 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 mm. First of all, then there will be the whole thing where you have 1910s or 1900. Describe that in basically the standard historical fashion of the war politics and the converse and uh, con like uh, uh, converse con like trade and the basic information that history books when radio was a thing and sport, basic pop culture stuff, uh, different foods, common food culture, etiquette, and stuff like that throughout every decade from 1900 to now. Uh, mm, mm. And then, yeah, no, and then, uh, the ordinary day is no longer necessary. You just describe what most historians would. Anyway, mm, 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 uh, decades, just ordinary descriptions of basic categories of types of things. Just the way of writing the writing style will be mm, mm, uh, mm, I don't know. Basically, mm, 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 um, decades book. Anyhow, what else? I don't know. Different opinions on art. Whatever. Different viewpoints on art timelines. Also describe. Yeah. Make a book that's kind of like describing different women in art and uh, 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 you make a book on the timeline of art, but with only including the viewpoints of women and only involve men when women have to engage with them, or when the women that you're describing would have had the way of having to bring up them. And then also mm, 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 basically describe women's art, catalog it, and only bring up the subject of men when it can't be devoid of them. Next, bestiary of bestiaries. That is to say, describe the viewpoints of people from as long as we had visual descriptions and also like artworks of animals, and describe what the animals looked like throughout history in different communities where those animals would have been foreign or hard to get a good recognition of from cave times to like the early 1950s or 60s or the 1950s or 1920s to 30s, maybe, depending on when we stopped having difficulty depicting something as foreign as a narwhal or a or maybe uh, a gazelle. No. Or maybe describe the appearance of a sloth, but how that has been depicted through art throughout history. Just document basically the different times and all of the wrong and unusual, bizarre approaches to how people throughout history, from cave times to about like the late 1800s to the early 1930s or 50s, you describe the all the unusual and bizarre ways people have depicted animals that they aren't familiar with. Uh, ungrateful. I don't know what to say. Make a book about your favorite animal. And then, I don't know. Um, um, make a bestiary. The archetype. Mm, 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 mm. There's another thing you wanted to talk about. Your life history. You wanted to make. You wanted to. You wanted to. Reach out to someone and have a commissioned work of a book of people who are old enough to remember people from um, the at the very earliest, the mid to late 1800s, and those specifically who have had childhood memories with those who have had childhood memories of that time period. And then also, you can also make like uh, uh, mm, uh, you can make a way to have the commissioner, or the commission that is, to basically start talking about their childhood. Make a book about how you learn a language with the methods that you use that other people have advised for you to use, and make a clear step-by-step guide in a unique way on how they could learn a language, and uh, do your best languages that you have so far learned, or are starting to learn, like Spanish, French, and German, and Dutch. And also try to outdo, if you can, or try to at least reproduce the processes in which someone might take to do something like that, of learn a language in the same type of acquiring sense. Give specific advice that has helped you for people. Talk about what you enjoy in a book, as a book, in book form. Autobiography, that will be your magnum opus, but for you realize you're likely gonna have maybe no years of life left. That is, if you reach the age of 99 years old, don't wait till you turn 99. When you turn 98 years old, basically start working on that book then. If not, when you turn 65 years old, you wait till you get diagnosed with some sort of death, uh, deadly disease, or some sort of evidence that you only have a few years of life left. Basically, have a goal set in mind from when you turn 65. You go, say, you basically spend 20 years working on a book at the age of 65. And this would be your magnum opus of your autobiography, and it will be, the book will be describing your life in two ways. From just the perspective of yourself talking about it like it was allowed, and then describe the idea in a fictionalized version of a third party, or a amalgamation of different people that you have actually talked about your life history with, throughout any time before you started working on this masterwork, as you want to put it, though it's not probably going to be that extraordinary. It's just going to be a beautiful accomplishment. Maybe make a book out of bronze. Goodbye.